Right, okay, let's talk a little bit about tournaments on the horizon and how congested it's going to be for the players. I mean, I was with Martin Keown on Friday.
Were you?
And we talked a little bit about Ben White. He was suggesting that player welfare might have been one of the reasons behind it.
Little doubt that would come out of Martin's
I thought you'd like that.
Yes, indeed.
Talking of player welfare, despite international tournaments being on the horizon this summer, Newcastle United, Tottenham, both of them heading to Australia. Newcastle will make the 21,000-mile round trip to face Tottenham at the Melbourne Cricket Ground on May the 22nd, 3 days after the end of the Premier League season and 3 days before the FA Cup final. The friendly in Australia is being billed as a homecoming for Ange Postecoglou, the Spurs head coach, who grew up in Melbourne and played and managed for South Melbourne. Newcastle keen to increase their global appeal as they look to widen their fan base and bring in more revenue streams to be able to compete with the Premier League's top teams. And Tottenham Hotspur and Newcastle both have players who are set to be involved in European Championship in Germany and in the Copa America as well. What do you make of this, bearing in mind we've spent the whole season talking about how many injured players we've got and how much travelling and how many games they've had to play?
So this game is taking place 3 days after the season finishes.
Correct.
And will the players who will be picked for their countries, European level, will they be participating in this game?
We have no confirmation of that, but you would assume so.
Okay. Well, then it's a total nonsense. An absolute nonsense, to go travel, 21,000 miles to play a game just to try and bolster your name around the world. I honestly think it's an absolute nonsense. What
do you think, as a man who would be trying to get as much commercial revenue as possible?
Well, I'm sure they're not flying on a turboprop. I'm sure they're flying in first class, and whilst it's probably not ideal, it's the nature of the beast. All the money in the room that football clubs generate gets sucked out by players and managers, and these are the things that ultimately make football clubs commercially more viable by building up fan bases, by building up revenue streams, and by building up their opportunity to increase their commercial gains. Look, it's an Australian game. I'm assuming Ange Postecoglou has no issue with it. I'm assuming Newcastle don't have that much of an issue. Most of the players are going to go on their holidays. What are we talking about? A competitive game? Not really. Are we talking about arduous travel where they're going to be schlepping through airports, carrying their bags, sitting in a bumpy plane? No, we're talking about players flying on a first-class flight, playing a game over in Australia, and then most of them going away for the rest of the summer and having a break.
You're okay with it?
I think it's something or nothing. I think that, we can get into this territory of going mad about how much players have to do. We've got Martin on one hand talking about having to have as many replays as we possibly can in the FA Cup, yet taking a commercial trip that in part generates the revenue that benefits the football club, that gives you more money to buy better players, that gives you more money to pay players.
Totally different. Absolutely totally different. Replays of competitive football matches in a competition that is really worthwhile, and travelling out to do a friendly game 21,000 miles away 3 days after the season is finished. It's a totally different situation. Absolutely. And it's always, Simon, strangely enough, it's always about the club having to raise some money to pay managers and players.
But it is.
All the time.
But it's a simple fact, isn't it?
Well, maybe the owner might want to try and put a couple of bob back in his pocket again.
Okay,
Perhaps. Right. He might want to do this. He might want to pay a chief executive who's been actually pretty poor, that he wants to sack a number of times beforehand, but hasn't the ability or hasn't the confidence or hasn't got the
What's that got to do with it? You've got the reality of football. Football's now a business, right? And the consequences of business are that you have to raise innate amount of revenue to be able to feed the ravenous beast. Your argument is, sod all that. It's some poor sod's philanthropic duty to be able to put money into your pocket and the player's pocket and not to exhaust every commercial opportunity to do it. But Martin, that's a one-dimensional way of looking at the world.
So no, it's not a one-dimensional way of looking at it.
You're the one who said it.
If you want to play the game, why don't you do it pre-season then? If that's the case, why don't you do it pre-season?
But then
people have travelled. I loved going to America.
Going off somewhere else.
When I was the manager of Celtic, when I was the manager of Aston Villa, I loved going to America to play pre-season games. Pre-season, getting yourself ready for the match.
So they're doubling up on pre-season and post-season tours now. Is that what it's going to be like?
I don't know why. There would always be some resistance. Someone somewhere would have an objection to it, whether it was pre-season or post-season. There would be some objection to it. But the commercial reality of football, whether you like it or you don't, is the major beneficiaries the major beneficiaries out of this revolution of the Premier League has been the players and the managers. Because once upon a time, if anyone told you guys the revenues that you were going to be getting, then you wouldn't have believed it. And now that it's here as a matter of course, now your response is, well, actually, sod that. Let's get some philanthropic sod to put his hand in his pocket and bridge the gap. And that's wrong, Martin.
Philanthropic sod. It's not. You're going to go and play a friendly game.
Your problem is you don't have a problem with going to Australia. You don't have a problem with players going there. It's just the timing of this particular game.
It's three days afterwards. Do you think that the players will be wanting to go to head off from that there? Absolutely not. Not at all.
So again,
no.
You can't
have
all the benefit, Martin. You can't have all the.
Is it going to be great for dressing room harmony? That.
Well, look. At the end of the day, it's not an ideal world. And I understand.
So that's going to solve all the problems. So it's going to solve all the financial problems if they do this one game.
No, of course not.
In front of
but there's obviously commercial reasons
people
behind it. And I'm assuming that the managers of the two clubs have been brought into the equation and had a discussion with. Now, it's not ideal. But you can't, on one hand, have all the wonderful benefits. And I don't want to keep making it about finances, but everything about football is in the end about finances. All we talk about is who's getting paid what transfer fees are, how much clubs are generating, and how much money players need to be paid. So with that comes a trade-off. In a less than ideal world, that trade-off, if I'm said to you at the beginning of the season, I'm going to ridiculous extremes.
Okay,
but if I go and say to you, I'm going to get 20 million out of this tour. No, sometimes you have to use hyperbole to make a point. But by the same token, if I say to you, I'm going to get 20 million out of this tour, and I'm going to give you a £50 million player as a result of it, you might change your tune.
Oh yeah, 20 million. I couldn't have seen that sort of figure being bandied around for a friendly game, one friendly match in Australia. But I do take your point. I do take your point. Absolutely. And strangely enough, if I was the manager, I haven't been to Australia now in 40 years.
Right.
I wouldn't mind the trip. To tell you the truth, I wouldn't
so what
mind
arguing with me for, then?
So, but I'm saying to you, it is a nonsense, really, because it's 3 days after the Premier League is over. The last thing you're thinking about is getting your bags. But as Sam said, possibility of players being involved in the competition
in the
European
nations.
Absolutely. That would be a concern.
And they may well be excluded.
Well, they may well be.
And if they're excluded, then the argument becomes slightly more moot, doesn't it?
Yes, I'll take that point. I'm not entirely.
But your staff, if you were a manager of a Premier League club, after 3 days after the end of the season, you wouldn't want to be expecting them, asking them to go again down in Australia, would you?
I wouldn't be. Not for the players who are going to be chosen in the competition. Personally, as a manager, I'm talking about me as a manager.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind a trip to Australia. My talk about it is this year. It's 3 days after the event. If that's the only time they can fit
Here's
it in,
another
good
question
luck
for
to
you.
It's also more important because the idea that a guy can just keep on throwing money into a football club is now being countermanded by the financial fair play and the profit and sustainability governance. So it can't just be someone going, I tell you what, I'm fool enough to bridge that gap. I'll put another 50 million quid in because some manager tells me I should.
Yeah,
you've now got to get into the territory
that
of commercial revenues.
Philanthropic sod, as you referred to.
No manager is telling the owner, "I'll just throw 50 million." It's not. That's not happening. It's not happening.
Not that I want to.
Do you know what? I was asked this question a couple of months ago. Could I, as a manager, ever have worked with Simon Jordan as an owner? And I, there was something came over me. I must have been feeling ill, and I said, "Yeah, I think I could do that. Do you know what? I'm completely refuting that now. Absolutely refuting that now. Please."
Not that I want to.
I'd have helped you over your Randy Lerner moment. I wouldn't have allowed you to have a tantrum and storm off. I would have counselled you down.
Yeah.
Not that I want to throw another spanner in the works here, but just humour me. What do you think it would do to the reputation of the Premier League's Green Weekend that two sides just decided to fly 21,000 miles across the world just to have a friendly?
Well, depends if I
think
that football should be fighting battles on behalf of societal issues. Depends what I think football's responsibility is there. I think it does absolutely nothing. I don't think it should do anything.
But here's a question for you. Maybe you might be right there, and it might not be their responsibility. But the fact that they do come out and try and make up this great big sort of the Premier League, they do a whole thing called a Green Weekend.
But
the fact that they do that.
But these are individual clubs.
So they're not part of the Premier League.
So if the Premier League said to the clubs,
the question I asked you was does it undermine the Premier League weekend? Green Weekend.
Well, no,
it doesn't.
Not particularly, because they've got people travelling on a flight to Australia
for commercial reasons, for entire commercial reasons.
Okay, So what are you asking me? Is the
I'm asking if it undermines...
Premier League making these ridiculous positional statements that have no substance behind them in the first place?
Does it render
like
it
the
pointless?
FA, whether they can fly a flag or whether they can't fly a flag.
Does it render it pointless?
I think it's pointless in the first place. Maybe if I was...
This doesn't enhance
Maybe
his claims,
if
though,
I
does
was
it?
tying myself to a tree and making donations to the Labour Party like Del Vence, then I might have some substance in this conversation. But I think it's a ridiculous argument anyway.
Okay.
On AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.